She was 19 and standing in the rain with nothing, no family, no savings, no forwarding address, just a battered canvas sewing bag and a crumpled $2 bill kept inside her left boot for 6 weeks. With that $2, she bought a condemned Victorian umbrella maker S shop on a narrow side street in Millhaven, New Hampshire. The front display window was shattered, the interior soaked by years of weather, and the antique teak work table had partially collapsed. But what nobody knew was that inside the hollow brass handle of a silk display parasol hanging in the ruined window, sealed by a fitted brass cap not turned in over 40 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're rewatching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Mae Calloway had been bracing for impact her whole life without knowing it. Childhood had not been a place of safety, but a relentless series of adjustments to conditions she did not choose. She grew up in a narrow rented house in a fading mill town in central New Hampshire, a place where the air perpetually smelled of damp concrete and the river that cut through the old industrial district ran the colour of iron rust in the spring rain. The house itself was functional rather than comfortable, the rooms small and close, the windows single-paned and draughty from October through April. Stability was an aspiration that existed somewhere outside their particular circumstances, visible in the well-maintained yards of other streets, but persistently absent from their own. Her mother, Claire, was a woman of considerable quiet strength and considerable quiet grief, both of which she carried simultaneously, without allowing either to become the other. She worked as a seamstress for a dry-cleaning establishment on the main commercial strip, a job that paid modestly and required her to sit under fluorescent light for 8 hours a day, drawing a heavy needle through other people's damaged clothes. Claire had a gift that the dry cleaner S fluorescent light could not diminish. She could look at any piece of fabric, however ruined, and immediately identify its structure, the direction of the grain, the way the fibres had been woven or knitted or cut. This was not a merely aesthetic skill, it was a form of deep material literacy, and she passed it to Mae the way some mothers pass down recipes, through patient repetition and careful physical demonstration. Claire would bring remnant pieces of fabric home from the shop, discarded silk scarves with small tears, linen suit jackets missing a button, wool coats with a split seam. She and Mae would sit together at the small kitchen table under the overhead light, and Claire would show her daughter exactly how to assess damage. Not how to hide it, she would clarify, but how to genuinely repair it, so the mended piece was structurally as strong as the original. A visible repair done honestly is worth more than a concealed one, Claire told her daughter on more than one occasion, guiding Mae's small fingers to feel the difference between a properly finished seam and a hidden patch that would eventually fail again under stress. It was a lesson that Mae absorbed entirely, though she could not have articulated its broader implications at the time. She could feel the difference between honest work and the kind of work designed only to postpone a problem until it became someone else's problem to solve. Mae was 11 when Claire remarried. Gerald Mace was a man who occupied physical space with an ease that bordered on aggression. He was large, had a commanding voice that filled whatever room he entered, and possessed a fundamental, absolute confidence in his own assessments of any situation. His assessments were delivered as facts and received as facts by most people he encountered, because his certainty left very little room for alternative interpretation. He was not cruel in obvious, documentable ways. The cruelty was subtler and more pervasive. It manifested in the precise way he evaluated the usefulness of other people, including his new stepdaughter. He looked at Mae the way a foreman looks at a tool he did not select but is obligated to work with a calculating tolerance that was one misalignment away from disposal. His habits were rigid and territorial. He sat in a specific chair, ate at a specific time, kept the television on a specific channel, and regarded deviations from these arrangements with a quiet, escalating displeasure that had a very particular edge to it. He and Claire had established a careful domestic equilibrium built entirely around his preferences, and Mae existed within that equilibrium as a variable he had agreed to accommodate but had not fully accepted. She learned to move through the rooms of the house with minimal friction, to occupy as little space as possible, to complete her homework at the kitchen table before he returned from work so the table could be cleared and set for his. She became expert at reading the quality of silence, the difference between a neutral silence and a pressurized one, the specific way the air in a room changes when someone large and certain is moving toward a decision. She sewed whenever she could. It was the one activity that reduced the ambient anxiety of the household to a manageable hum. She could sit in her small bedroom with the door closed and a piece of fabric in her hands, and the sharp, specific demands of the work, the necessity of staying precisely on the seam line, of maintaining the correct tension in the of trimming the allowances to an exact quarter-inch, were demanding enough to displace everything else. She made alterations for neighbours for small amounts of cash that she saved meticulously in an envelope inside her winter boot, a habit she had observed in her mother and adopted without conscious thought. She had completed her junior year of high school when Gerald S. tolerance finally reached its natural conclusion. The argument, when it finally arrived, was not dramatic in the way arguments are portrayed in films. It was quiet, and that was what made it definitive. Mae had spent 3 hours repairing a neighbouress wool coat for $12, and Gerald had found the money on the kitchen counter before she could put it in her boot. He did not shout. He simply informed her in the flat, carrying tone of a foreman concluding an assessment, that she was not contributing proportionally to the household, and that the arrangement had run its useful course. Claire said. The silence from her mother-s direction lasted long enough for Mae to understand that the equilibrium had been calculated with a very specific margin, and she fell outside. She packed her canvas sewing bag. She took her boot money, $2 remaining after she had paid for thread and a replacement needle the week prior. She walked out into the rain that had been falling since mid-afternoon and did not look back at the house. She walked for a long time in the rain, the cold water soaking through her canvas jacket and her jeans, her canvas bag a heavy sodden weight over one shoulder. The streets of the mill town were empty and very quiet, the rain flattening all ambient sound, so that her own footsteps seemed extraordinarily loud against the wet concrete. She had no destination. She had a direction, which was simply away, and for the first night that was the only navigation available to her. The next weeks were a brutal and clarifying education in the specific weight of having nothing. She slept in the covered entryways of commercial buildings on warmer nights and in the all-night laundromat on the coldest ones, folding herself into the orange plastic chairs while the machines ran their cycles around her. She ate when she could get meals, and when she could not, she didn't. She discovered the particular discipline that deprivation imposes, how it narrows attention to the immediate and necessary, stripping away every concern that is not directly related to the mechanics of survival. She moved through 3 towns in the span of 5 weeks, following the road north toward the smaller, quieter settlements where the cost of basic subsistence was slightly lower than in the mill town. She picked up 2 days of work at a farm stand outside Claremont, carrying heavy crates of late-season apples from the orchard to the display tables for $7 a day. A woman at a church in Newport allowed her to sleep in the church hall for 4 nights in exchange for hemming the curtains in the fellowship room, work Mae completed in a single afternoon that would have taken the woman S, regular seamstress, a full day. A hardware store owner in Sunapee let her shelter under his loading dock awning during a particularly violent 3-day rainstorm without asking any questions or requiring any payment beyond the courtesy of being gone before he raised the loading doors at 7 in the morning. She carried the $2 like a talisman, not spending them even when she was most desperate, intuiting in some part of herself that the money represented not just currency, but some fundamental threshold she was not yet ready to cross. She had lived below the line for weeks, but she had not yet reached absolute zero. The $2 were the evidence of. It was in the public library in Millhaven on a Thursday afternoon in late October that she found the advertisement. She had gone in primarily for the warmth and the electrical outlet near the periodicals section, where she could charge the old cell phone she carried, which had no service plan but still held a clock and a flashlight. She was leafing through a stack of local weekly papers that the library kept in a wooden rack near the entrance, old editions going back several months, when a small notice in the county property listings caught her. Property No. 8C. Holloway Lane. Former commercial structure umbrella maker S shop. Victorian era. Delinquent taxes, high $10. Structure condemned. County invites sealed bids. May read the notice a second time more slowly. Victorian era, umbrella maker. The words had a specific texture in her mind, a quality of handcraft and patience, and the kind of deliberate skill that did not belong to the era of mass production. She thought about the way her mother's hands moved over a piece of fabric, certain and quiet. She thought about the canvas sewing bag sitting athwart her feet under the library table, heavy with the specific tools of her one genuine competence. She had $2. The delinquent tax was $2. She tore a small piece from the margin of the newspaper, a practice the library strictly prohibited, but May weighed the transgression against the alternative and made her choice, and wrote down the property address and the county clerk's contact information. She folded the paper precisely and put it in her jacket pocket. She sat for another hour, thinking through the logic of the situation. She had nowhere to sleep that night. She had no prospects for income beyond small, irregular alterations. She had a sewing bag and $2 and a skill that required a workspace to be worth anything at all. The math, such as it was, pointed in a single direction. She found a sheet of paper in a recycling bin near the printer station, addressed a bid to the county property office in careful, very neat handwriting. Her mother S. handwriting had always been beautiful, and May S. was an unconscious imitation of it, and dropped the sealed envelope into the mail slot of the post office 2 blocks from the library before the 5 o'clock collection. 12 days later, walking back to the library to check the general delivery window, she found a county envelope waiting for her. She stood on the post office steps and read it twice in the thin November light, the cold wind off the river cutting through her jacket. Her bid had been accepted. She had 3 days to appear at the county clerk's office, vaceptihat payment. She walked the full length of Millhaven S main commercial street 3 times before she went in. Millhaven was a small, weathered, New Hampshire town set in a narrow river valley between 2 low ridges of maple and white pine. The town had been built on a tradition of small-scale manufacture and stubborn thrift, visible in the construction of its commercial buildings, heavy granite foundations, dark brick upper story, deep overhanging eaves designed by people who understood that the winter would be long and the snow would be relentless. By late November, the maples on the ridges had shed their leaves entirely, and the birches stood white and bare against the dark. The air was completely cold, carrying a specific quality that New England air has in late autumn, clean and sharp and already containing the first faint molecular suggestion of ice. May walked into the Merrimack County Clerk's office on a Tuesday morning, carrying her canvas sewing bag and wearing every layer of clothing she owned, which amounted to 2 pairs of socks, jeans, a thermal shirt, a denim jacket, and a fleece pullover from the church thrift bin in Newport. She had $2 in her boot, which was where they had been since the first night she left Gerald Mace's house. and a county notification letter folded into her jacket pocket. The clerk's office was a room that smelled of heated paper and old wood, the walls lined with heavy filing cabinets and bound volumes of county records going back a century and a half. The heating was loud, a radiator that knocked and hissed but effective. Mae stood at the counter for a moment, simply absorbing the warmth, which she had not felt in a genuinely sustained way for some time. The county clerk was a woman named Ruth Barker, 61 years old, with a practical grey bun and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the deliberate, unhurried manner of a person who had processed every variety of human circumstance across 30 years behind the same counter. She looked at Mae with the specific attention of someone who had learned to read situations efficiently, taking in the layered clothing, the wet canvas bag, the careful way the girl was holding herself upright against obvious exhaustion. "You here for the Holloway Lane property," Ruth said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," Mae said. Ruth pulled a thick folder from a cabinet and laid it open on the counter. She turned pages with the methodical efficiency of long practice. "Mott need to go over some things with you before we proceed," she said, in a tone that was not unkind but was absolutely clear about its intent. "That building has been closed since Mornincheen Sao High. The previous owner, Eleanor Marsh, died in Mornincheen Sao Cheen. The estate never settled the property, and the county has been carrying it on delinquent tax rolls for decades. The structure itself is Victorian-era construction, which means it was built roughly between Mortin Tam Tam Me and Mortin Tam Chin Me Lum. The front display window has been broken since at least Hein Cumlin Tam Tam. There is documented water intrusion in the ground floor. The roof lost 3 sections of cedar shake in a storm 3 years ago and has not been repaired." "Mott understand," Mae said. "You cannot live in a condemned structure without an occupancy permit," Ruth continued, watching Mae's face. "The county inspector would need to assess the property and approve repairs before granting occupancy. That process takes time and requires demonstrated work." "Mott know how to repair fabric damage," Mae said. Then paused, hearing the inadequacy of the statement in the context of a building with a broken window and a compromised roof. Mott learn other things quickly. Ruth studied her for a long, quiet moment. "May Mott ask your age?" 19, Mae said. Ruth looked at her for another moment, then pulled a standard deed transfer form from the folder. "Do you have the $2? Mae reached into her boot and produced 2 deeply creased, slightly damp dollar bills. She laid them on the counter with both hands, as deliberately as she could manage. Ruth smoothed the bills flat, placed them in the cash drawer, stamped the deed form twice with a brass stamp that landed with the sound of a decision being made, and signed her name in blue ink. She slid the deed across the counter. "The key is on a hook by the back door of the property," she said. "The front lock hasn't worked since the 80s. You look need to go around the alley." She paused. "Holloway Lane is 2 blocks east and 3 south. The building has a green door, or it did. The paint may have gone by." Then she did something unexpected. She reached under the counter and produced a folded brown paper bag. "Mott brought too much lunch," she said. "Turkey sandwich and an apple. The sandwich will just go stale." Mae took the bag. She said thank you twice, once immediately and once from the door. She went around the corner and stood in the alley doorway of the old umbrella shop and ate the sandwich in 6 bites, standing up, before she allowed herself to look at anything else. The building at the end of Holloway Lane was narrow and tall, 2 stories, built of dark red brick with a decorative pressed tin facade at street level that had weathered to a patchy mottled grey-green. The front window, or Vaikep Hatta Te had been the front window, was a wide curved bay design that must have been elegant in its original state, intended to display finished umbrellas and parasols behind beveled glass to pedestrians on the street below. The glass was gone, replaced imperfectly with a sheet of corrugated metal screwed to the window frame at irregular intervals, gaps visible along the edges where the wind and weather had worked their way inside without invitation. Above the window, faint gold lettering was still barely legible on the dark brick: E. Marsh, umbrella and parasol maker, Mortam Chinmi. The green door in the alley was a very dark, weathered green, nearly grey, set in a heavy brick archway with a small canopy over it that was missing its outermost edge. The key hung on a bent nail exactly as Ruth Barker had said. It was a long, slender iron key of the type specific to the late 19th century, the kind of key cast from a single mould with a small trefoil at the bow. Mae took it from the nail, inserted it in the lock, and felt the mechanism engage with the particular resistance of a mechanism that had not been turned in a very long time. She applied slow, steady pressure, not force but patience, and the tumblers eventually yielded, the bolts sliding back with a sound that was more resonant than a click, more like a small, definite statement. The door swung inward on hinges that needed oil but did not need replacement. The smell that came out was complex and immediately legible to someone who had grown up around fabric, damp wool, dry silk, aged lacquer, and beneath all of that, faintly but distinctly, the particular clean smell of old cedar, which is resistant to moisture and insects in a way that ordinary wood is not. She stepped inside and let her eyes adjust. The ground floor was a single long room, narrower than it appeared from outside, running from the alley entrance all the way through to the boarded front window. The ceiling was pressed tin, the same material as the facade, patterned in overlapping fans that were darkened with age but structurally intact. The walls were panelled in tongue-and-groove chestnut, a wood that had been largely eliminated from American forests by blight in the early 20th century, and was now extraordinarily rare, its dark honey colour still visible beneath decades of accumulated grime. Heavy built-in display shelves ran the length of the right wall from floor to ceiling, designed originally to hold completed umbrellas at a slight angle for display. An antique teak work table, perhaps 12 feet long, occupied the centre of the room. One leg had given way at the joint and the table rested at a mild but noticeable tilt, the dropped corner resting on the floor. A second table along the left wall held a Victorian treadle sewing machine, the iron base elaborately scrolled and cast in patterns that had been beautiful once and were still, under the rust and grime, beautiful now. Mae set her canvas bag on the tilted work table and walked the length of the room slowly, touching nothing, simply assessing. She had no heat, no running water, no electricity, and the front window was open to the November air through the gaps in the corrugated metal covering. The temperature inside the building was several degrees colder than outside, because the thick brick walls retained cold the way they retained heat in summer, with complete indifferent efficiency. But the bones were right. The ceiling was intact, the floor, wide pine planks worn smooth by a century of foot traffic, showed no signs of structural failure when she walked them carefully. The walls were damp along the lower 8 inches where the floor met the panelling, but the panels above that line were dry and firm. The damage was real, but it was not structural. It was the difference between a garment with a torn seam and a garment with a shredded backing. The former was fixable, the latter was scrap. In the far corner, near the boarded window, a wood-burning stove sat on a brick pad. It was a late Victorian parlour model, cast iron, octagonal, with small mica windows in the door through which the fire would have been visible. The stovepipe connected to a chimney flue built into the brick wall. Mae found the stove damper handle, turned it experimentally, and felt it move with a slight resistance that meant the damper was operational but stiff. She opened the stove door. The interior was ash-free, suggesting the stove had been cleaned before the shop was closed, and the cast-iron surfaces, while dull with oxidization, were sound. She gathered what dry material she could find: 2 sheets of aged newspaper from under the teak table, a handful of broken stick wood from a small pile near the back door, and several pieces of what appeared to be discarded umbrella handle blank. Turned wooden cylinders never finished into actual handles, dry and pale from decades inside the sheltered room. She built a small fire in the cast-iron stove with the deliberateness of someone who had learned in the past weeks that small amounts of combustible material needed to be treated with absolute respect. The fire caught, the newspaper flaring quickly, the dry stickwood engaged. She closed the stove door and left the damper half open to draw. She returned to the work table, lifted her canvas bag to the higher end, and sat on the floor with her back against the chestnut panelling, facing the growing warmth from the stove. She was inside, out of the rain, with a fire and walls. She pulled her knees to her chest and allowed herself, for the first time in 6 weeks, to breathe without any immediate calculation attached to the. She looked at the display shelves along the right wall and noticed, for the first time, that they were not entirely empty. Near the top of the centre section, hung on a small, specialised hook at the correct display angle, was a single parasol. It was Victorian. That was immediately evident from the proportions, the short handle relative to the canopy, and the elaborate handle design that she could make out even from across the room. The canopy was covered in silk that had once been a deep, warm ivory, now faded to an uneven pale cream with darker patches where the original dye had held against time, and lighter patches where the light had bleached it. The ribs were visible through the worn silk in several places, fine, elegantly curved whalebone ribs, historically correct for the period, each one following the same graceful arc. The whole object had the quality of a thing that had been beautiful in a specific, irreplaceable way, and was now approaching the final condition of beautiful things that are not adequately protected, which is dissolution. Some parasols are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The first 3 days were a strict education in what could and could not be deferred. Water could not be deferred, which meant learning the location of the public restroom at the county library, 2 blocks away, and the outdoor spigot at the back of the hardware store on Dunmore Street, whose owner, a man named Carl Whitfield, she had not yet met, but whose unlocked spigot she had already used twice for washing water, with the specific guilty efficiency of someone who intends to make things right when able. Food could be deferred somewhat, which she was already experienced with. Cold could be managed but not eliminated with the small cast-iron stove, which she was learning to operate with a miser-esque precision, burning only what she absolutely needed to maintain a temperature that kept her functioning. The compromised front window was the most immediately dangerous vulnerability, allowing a steady infiltration of cold air through the gaps in the corrugated metal cover, and she spent the better part of the second morning stuffing those gaps with strips of wool blanket material she found folded in a cedar chest behind the display shelves, material that had the quality of fabric stored properly for a long time, epira, dry, still holding its structure. On the morning of the 3rd day, she walked up Dunmore Street to Whitfield's Hardware and introduced herself. Carl Whitfield was a man in his mid-60s who had operated the store for 38 years, the kind of man whose entire bearing communicated a straightforward assessment of the world as a place that rewarded honest work and punished careless work in roughly equal and predictable proportion. He had a wide face, large hands, and a habit of listening with his full attention, which is rarer than it sounds. He looked at Mae carefully when she explained her situation, that she had purchased the Holloway Lane property, that she needed to establish a line of credit, and that she could work off the debt doing alterations for any customers who needed it, at a rate they could agree on. "The Marsh shop," Carl said. He leaned his forearms on the wooden counter and considered this. "Eleanor Marsh was my grandmother's friend. Used to make the parasols for the Methodist ladies' summer social every year. Quality work. He looked at Mae. What do you know about umbrella making? Mought know fabric construction and repair, Mae said. Seams. Structure. Grain. The mechanical parts of umbrella making Mort can learn from the tools in the shop. There are books. Carl studied her face for a long moment, the particular attention of a man evaluating something he was genuinely uncertain about. Then he pulled a ledger from under the counter and wrote her name at the top of a clean page. You can work off credit at $6 an hour doing alterations. Mort look send people over when they come in asking. Don't he expect a flood? He put the ledger away. Mort look bring some dry pine splits by this afternoon. For the stove, you should be burning furniture. Mae had not been burning furniture, but she had been burning some things that were in the shop that she should have been burning, and she did not argue the point. Carl brought the pine splits that afternoon and also, without commentary, a gallon of drinking water in a plastic jug and a small metal tin of shortbread cookies that he set on the work table without looking at Mae directly, in the manner of a person performing an act of care who finds direct acknowledgement of that act uncomfortable. Over the following week, while the temperature outside dropped steadily toward the serious cold of the New Hampshire December, Mae conducted a thorough, methodical inventory of the shop's contents. She worked systematically, beginning at the front display section and moving to the back workroom. The display shelves held very little beyond the ivory parasol and several umbrella frames in various states of incompletion, ribs and stretchers assembled but not covered, waiting for silk or bombazine that had never arrived. The teak work table, once she propped its broken corner with a salvaged brick and levelled it approximately true, revealed several shallow drawers running along it. The drawers contained the material record of Eleanor Marsh's professional life. Sewing needles in graduated sizes specifically designed for silk work, thin and very sharp verkepitehat small eyes, bobbins of silk thread in colours that had faded from their original richness to pale, dusty versions of crimson, navy and gold, a set of specialized ferrule setting tools for attaching the metal tip to the point of an umbrella, and a box of small hand-cut steel springs used in the runner mechanism that holds an umbrella open. The back workroom was separated from the display room by a narrow doorway with a curtain of heavy cotton batting, now grey with age, that had served as a dust barrier. Behind it, the workroom held 2 additional treadle machines, both in better condition than the one in the front room, and a long cutting table made of white pine planks on sawhorses, its surface permanently marked with the ghost impressions of patterns cut across it over decades. On a shelf above the cutting table stood a row of wooden form heads in various sizes, used for shaping and sizing umbrella canopies, and beside them, precisely wrapped in cloth, a complete set of curved pattern pieces in heavy cardboard, the master templates for every size of umbrella and parasol that Eleanor Marsh had produced. Mae unwrapped the pattern pieces with particular care, laying them out on the cutting table and examining them closely. They were cut with extraordinary precision, the curves identical on both sides of a hat piece, the grain lines marked in pencil with the confident exactness of someone who had made these marks 1,000 times. The proportions were correct for the Victorian style, the canopy sections narrower and the rib curve more pronounced than modern umbrella patterns, and they were in perfect condition. They represented decades of refined professional knowledge, the cumulative experience of a woman who had understood the specific engineering requirements of a device that needed to be both structurally sound against wind and rain and aesthetically composed enough to carry in public with satisfaction. Mae sat on the cutting table and looked at the pattern pieces spread around her for a long time, saying nothing. It was on the 7th day, A Thursday, while she was engaged in the specific task of cleaning the display parasol that she had been putting off because she recognized it as something that deserved care and time she had not previously been able to give it, that she made her discovery. She had taken the ivory parasol down from its display hook with both hands, turning it carefully to assess the damage to the canopy silk before attempting any cleaning. The silk was genuinely deteriorated in several areas, splits along the panel seams where the thread had rotted through, and a larger tear near the tip where the fabric had simply given way under the accumulated weight of dust and time. The ribs were sound. She had checked them individually. The canopy itself would require substantial reconstruction before the parasol could be considered restored, but the bones, as with the building, were right. The handle was brass, approximately 10 inches long, turned in a shape that was slightly thicker at the grip and tapered toward the ferrule end. It was elaborately decorated with a pattern of twisted rope motifs, oxidized to a deep, uneven brown that showed gold at the ridges where handling had kept the metal polished. Near the top of the handle, where it met the parasol shaft, there was a small decorative collar, also brass, also rope patterned, that appeared to be simply ornamental. Mae held the parasol shaft in one hand and the decorative collar between the fingers of her other hand, and out of an instinct that she could not have explained, some combination of the tactile literacy her mother had passed to her, and the particular alertness that weeks of scarcity had honed in her, she turned the collar experimentally in her. It moved. Not a great deal. Perhaps a quarter turn. But it moved with the slight resistance of a threaded fitting that has not been engaged in a very long time. And Mae felt immediately and with complete certainty that this movement was intentional, that the collar was not a collar but a cap, and that something was inside the handle below it. She set the parasol on the work table and stood very still for a moment, her hands resting at her sides. Then she picked it up again, held the shaft firmly, and applied a slow, steady rotational force to the brass cap. It resisted for several turns with the specific friction of a fine thread that had been sealed against moisture by decades of oxidation building up in the gaps. And then, quite suddenly, the resistance gave way, and the cap came free in her hand with a soft, clean pop of equalized pressure. She turned the parasol upside down over the work table, holding it by the open end of the handle, and tipped it gently. Something slid out slowly at first and then with gathering momentum and fell onto the work table with a weight that surprised her, a tight cylinder of paper rolled very small and secured with a narrow strip of silk ribbon so old it had stiffened to a pale, fragile. And then, behind the paper cylinder, a dense roll of paper currency, bound with a rubber band that had long since disintegrated into a ring of dark, brittle fragments that crumbled when she touched them. Mae sat down on the work table stool very slowly. The currency was old, she could tell from the appearance immediately, the smaller portraits in the particular shade of green that predated the modern redesigns. She counted heart stack with careful hand. The bills were uncirculated, still crisp despite their age, preserved in the hollow interior of the brass handle away from light and moisture. When she was finished counting, she counted again, because the first total seemed incorrect. It was not incorrect. $35,000 in vintage $100 bills had been stored inside the brass handle of a Victorian display parasol for an unknown number of decades, waiting with the patience of hidden things for the moment of their discovery. She set the money on one side of the work table and picked up the paper cylinder. She untied the silk ribbon vase, Capite hat extreme care. It was nearly as fragile as the rice paper it resembled, and unrolled the cylinder on the work table. It opened into a set of papers, perhaps 20 sheets, each one a hand-drawn pattern piece on drafting paper, rendered in the precise, confident lines of an experienced designer. They were fabric-cutting patterns, but not for umbrellas. They were patterns for garments, A bodice with an unusual construction at the shoulder seams, a series of sleeve variations, a skirt with a complex pleating system at the waistband that she had never seen before. Each pattern piece was annotated in small, meticulous handwriting, noting seam allowances, grain lines, interfacing requirements, and in several cases small notes in what appeared to be French. The draftsmanship was exceptional, the kind of pattern work that represented a complete and sophisticated design education, the kind that came from formal training rather than self-teaching. Tucked at the centre of the rolled patterns was a thick envelope of cream-coloured paper, sealed with a wax impression that had hardened to a dark amber over time. Mae held it in both hands. On the outside, in the same meticulous handwriting as the pattern annotations, were 3 words, "For the finder." She placed the envelope on the work table beside the money and the pattern sheets. She walked to the cast-iron stove and added 2 pieces of pine to the fire. She stood for a moment with her back to the warmth, looking at the 3 objects on the work table, the money, the patterns, the letter, and understood that she was standing at a specific threshold, the kind that cannot be uncrossed once you step. She had found money enough to change her material situation completely. She had found pattern work of a quality and sophistication beyond anything she had encountered in her training, which was self-directed and incomplete. She had found a letter from a woman who had known, when she sealed these things inside the brass handle and put the parasol back on the display hook and closed the shop for the last time, that someone would eventually come. She did not open the letter that night. She wrapped the money in a piece of clean cotton muslin from the workroom shelf, secured it with a length of narrow silk ribbon she found in the display drawer, and placed it inside her canvas sewing bag in the bottom corner beneath her tool. She rolled the pattern sheets back into their cylinder with careful hands and tied them with the original silk ribbon. She placed the envelope on the shelf above the cutting table in the back workroom, propped against the row of wooden parasol forms, where she could see it from anywhere in the room. She was not ready for the letter yet. She needed one night in between the finding and the reading, one night to let the air settle around the discovery before adding the weight of the words inside. She lay on her improvised bed, a folded canvas drop-cloth from the corner of the back room over the pine floor, her canvas jacket as a pillow, 2 layers of the wool batting from the curtain as a blanket, and listened to the sounds of Millhaven at night. The wind in the maple trees at the top of Holloway Lane, the distant occasional sound of a vehicle on the main street, the small domestic sound of the cast-iron stove cooling as the fire died down to coals. She was 19 years old and had $2 in taxes as her total financial history in this place, and $35,000 in an old brass parasol handle lying under her canvas tools, and a letter she hadn't read, and a building that needed a front window and a roof repair, and a new stovepipe section, and a dozen other things she would figure out one by one. Some parasols are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The morning arrived with a pale, clear light that comes in New England in the last days before the serious winter snow sets in, a brilliant, thin light with no warmth in it, the kind that illuminates everything with extraordinary clarity and carries the cold in every photo. Mae woke before it was fully light, built the fire back from coals, and spent 20 minutes doing the practical morning tasks she had developed into a reliable sequence over the past week. Water from the jug, simple food from what she had, a careful assessment of the fire-s needs for the coming hour. Then she went to the shelf above the cutting table and took down the cream-coloured envelope. She had no letter opener. She used the blade of her small seam ripper, running it along the sealed edge of the envelope with care, not wanting to damage what was inside. The wax seal broke cleanly along the seam, and she lifted the flap and withdrew 3 sheets of cream-coloured stationery covered in the same meticulous handwriting she had seen on the pattern annotation. "My dear one, whoever you are, Mott have been writing this letter in my mind for several years before committing it to paper. which is why it may have a particular quality of rehearsed certainty in the lines that follow. Mot Calloway kept what Mot wished to say, and Mot believe you deserve to hear it plainly. My name is Eleanor Marsh. Mort began this shop in Morning Tam Chi Mot at the age of 23, with a set of tools my teacher gave me and a lease on these premises that cost me $14 for the first month, which at that time represented everything Mott had managed to save across 18 months of working in the textile mills in Manchester while taking umbrella making lessons on Saturday afternoons from a woman named Hild Brower, who had learned the trade in Vienna and brought it to New Hampshire with the thoroughness that Viennese craftspeople brought to everything. Hilda was not sentimental about her teeth. She was precise and she was demanding, and she told me on the day she determined Mott was sufficiently skilled to proceed independently that the umbrella is the most honest object a craftsperson can make because it must perform its function under the worst possible conditions. A parasol may be beautiful and fragile and may be excused for not standing up to a storm, but an umbrella that fails in rain is a failure of craft, not. Mott have carried that sentence with me for 60 years. Mott am writing this in Mottin Chincham Sao Mai Mott. Mott am 73 years old. My hands are no longer reliable enough for the fine silk work, and Mott have made the decision to close the shop rather than reduce the quality of what comes out of it. This is not a decision Mott arrived at easily, and Mott will not pretend otherwise. This shop has been the central fact of my adult life, the place where Mott have spent my most concentrated hours and produced my most honest work. Leaving it is a kind of dying that happens before the other kind. Mott am leaving the money because Mott have no family and no one Mott trust to use it correctly. The patterns are my own designs, developed over 20 years of thinking about the construction of women's garments as an engineering problem rather than a decorative one. Mott trained formally in design at the Boston School of Design in Monin Tam Tam Michin and Monin Tam Chin Mui before Mott came to umbrella making, and Mott have never entirely left that training behind. The patterns represent solutions to problems of shoulder seam stress and skirt balance that Mott believe are genuinely better solutions than what is currently standard. Mott don't know what year you are reading this. Mott hope you have the training to read them. If you do not, find someone who. The money was earned here over 60 years by making things carefully and charging fairly for them and spending less than Mott earned. It sounds simple. It is not simple. It requires decades of discipline and the willingness to find sufficiency in modest circumstances, which is a form of intelligence that is not particularly valued, but is, in my experience, among the most practically useful. Mott am leaving it to you because you found it, which means you came here, which means something brought you to this specific building among all the buildings in all the towns in the state. Mott believe that means you have some claim. The shop can be rebuilt. The treadle machines work. The large one in the back room needs only a replacement belt, which Carl Whitfield at the hardware store can order. The patterns are all here. The tools are all. The wood in this building is better than anything being built today. Chestnut panelling of that quality cannot be replaced, only preserved. The silk trade has changed since my time, but the fundamental requirements of the material have. What you need, beyond the tools and the money, is the willingness to learn something slowly, which Mott suspect you already have, or you would not have found your way to a Victorian umbrella shop in a small New Hampshire town in the first place. Mott leave you with one thing. Mott have learned that Mott believe is genuinely useful regardless of what you do with the rest of what Mott Vievi told you. An umbrella is the only object a person carries into the worst weather by choice. It does not eliminate the rain. It does not make the day warmer or the distance shorter. What it does is provide a person with a small portable assertion of their own right to exist in the storm without being destroyed by it. A good umbrella held over one's own head is a quiet and powerful statement. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Eleanor Marsh. Umbrella Maker. Written on the 15th day of March, in the year Motnin Chincham Saumi Mort. Mae read the letter through once, then folded it along its existing creases, placed it back in the envelope, and held the envelope in both hands for a long moment, sitting on the cutting table stool in the cold, clear morning light. She did not cry. The emotion was something more specific and less immediate than grief or joy. It was the sensation of being addressed directly by someone who had thought about the address with someone who had considered the specific shape of the unknown recipient and had aimed their words precisely at that shape. It was the feeling of being unexpectedly and entirely understood. She went outside onto Holloway Lane and stood in the cold morning, the clear winter light on her face. Across the narrow lane a small maple tree grew from the cracked pavement of the alley, its bare branches holding the light in very fine, detailed lines against the pale sky. She stood there until she was properly cold and then went back inside and put 2 pieces of pine on the fire. She spent the rest of the morning thinking about what she had, and then, in the afternoon, she went to the hardware store. Before we continue, Mott want to ask you something. Think of the best piece of advice you ever received from someone who had no obligation to give it. A stranger, an acquaintance, someone who simply chose to share what they knew. Leave it in the comment. These things matter more than people realize, and reading them reminds the rest of us to pay them forward. Carl Whitfield looked up from the counter when Mae pushed through the door. She had the letter in her jacket pocket and the small wrapped cylinder of pattern sheets under her arm. Mott found some things in the shop, she said. Carl waited. There was money in the parasol handle on the display shelf. A significant amount. She paused. Mott want to know if there's anything Mott need to do legally before Mott use it. If there's an estate, or a claim, or something Mott met not aware of. Carl was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was doing something real with the question he'd been asked. Eleanor died in Morchin Saumichin, he said. The estate was settled eventually. There wasn't much of it. The property taxes just kept accumulating because the county had no one to bill. If the money was in the building and the building transferred to you by legitimate deed, Mott D say you have a reasonable claim. But you should talk to Vera Kimball on County Road before you do anything. She's a notary, but she knows the law. He looked at the pattern cylinder. What are those? Her patterns, Mae said. Her own designs. They re-sophisticated, formally trained sophisticated. Mott never seen construction like this. Carl was quiet for another moment. Eleanor went to art school, he said. She used to say umbrella making suited her because it was design that had to hold up in real weather. Mae walked to Vera Kimball's office that afternoon and spent an hour in a warm room going over the situation with a woman who combined legal precision with the particular matter-of-fact warmth of someone who had spent many years making the law comprehensible to people who found it intimidating. Vera confirmed that the transfer of property by county deed carried the contents of the property with it, that no estate claim remained on the Holloway Lane building or its contents, and that Mae's claim to everything inside the building was clean and defensible. She typed up a short notarized statement to that effect, charged Mae $12, which Mae paid from her work credit account with Carl, and sent her on her way. Mae walked to the Independent Bank on Main Street and deposited $28,000. She kept $7,000 in the canvas sewing bag. She had a plan. The roof had lost 3 sections of cedar shake in a storm that Carl Whitfield described as having arrived from the north in November of the previous year, with the kind of wind that did not behave like New Hampshire wind and was generally attributed by the locals to conditions that had become increasingly unpredictable. 3 sections of shake missing from a roof in New Hampshire as winter is not an aesthetic problem. It is a structural one, because snow and ice do not require large openings to cause serious water damage, only small ones allowed to persist. Mae spent 2 days on the roof in the first week of December, working in temperatures that required 2 pairs of socks and a borrowed set of insulated work gloves from Carl S. She had purchased 2 bundles of red cedar shakes, number 1 grade, 18 inches, hand-split and resawn, and the specific galvanized nails required for correct installation from Carl S. store at a total cost of $61.40, which she noted in a small spiral notebook she had started keeping as a running account of every expenditure and every hour of labor. She had spent an afternoon at the library reading about cedar shake installation and another afternoon watching Carl S. employee, a quiet young man named Thomas, demonstrate the specific overlapping pattern and the correct exposure measurement on a piece of demonstration board Carl kept behind the counter for exactly this type of situation. The installation itself was slow, cold, and required a physical confidence at height that Mae had to develop through the discomfort of not having. She wore a safety rope tied to the brick chimney stack, which was sound, and she moved across the roof with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided that caution is not the same as fear, and that proceeding carefully is not the same as not proceeding. The replacement sections required attention to the alignment of the existing courses of shake around them, matching the exposure, the amount of each shingle visible below the one above it, exactly to the surrounding courses so the finished repair was visually continuous with the original roof. When she climbed down after the second day and stood on Holloway Lane looking up at the result, the replacement sections were clearly distinguishable. The new cedar was a fresh pale gold against the silver grey of the surrounding aged shakes, but the alignment was perfect. In 2 years the new cedar would weather to match the old, and the repair would be invisible. Elias Thorne from the hardware store in the next town over, who had come by to assess an unrelated matter for Carl and had watched her work from the alley without introducing himself, told Carl afterward that the girl on the Marsh roof had more sense than most of the contractors he'd hired in the past decade. Carl did not immediately tell Mae this, but he eventually did, and she wrote it in the spiral notebook. The cast-iron stove had been a reliable source of heat through November and into December, but Mae had observed kept increasing attention a smell in the shop that she could not account for, a faint, sharp chemical scent on mornings when the wind came from the northeast and the stove was working hard. She had read enough by that point to know that this smell was creosote, which is not merely a nuisance but a specific structural hazard in a building with century-old timber framing, and she had watched the cast-iron stovepipe closely enough to identify the exact joint, 3rd section from the bottom, where the smell was strong. Carl ordered a replacement stovepipe section of the correct diameter, 6 inches, single-wall black stovepipe, and a new slip coupling to connect it to the existing sections above and below. The replacement took 40 minutes once Mae had the sections apart, the primary challenge being that the existing sections had seated themselves into a friction fit over decades, and did not release their grip easily. Carl brought her a specific pipe wrench for the purpose, demonstrating the technique on the first joint himself, not doing the work, demonstrating the technique, which Mae appreciated as the correct distinction. Beyond the stovepipe, the brick chimney itself needed attention. The mortar joints between the old bricks in the visible section above the roofline had deteriorated significantly, and Mae was determined not to let another winter of freeze-thaw cycles make the deterioration worse before she could address it. She bought a bag of Type S masonry mortar from Carl, a margin trowel, and a joint raking tool, and spent 3 mornings at the end of January raking the old mortar out of the joints to a depth of 3/4 of an inch and packing in new mortar with the trowel. She worked in temperatures that hovered just above freezing, aware that mortar should not be applied when the temperature is below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and watching the thermometer with the vigilance of someone who had been taught that patience and observation were the foundational tool. She was right at the edge of the acceptable temperature window on 2 of the 3 mornings. The mortar cured correctly. The chimney was sound. The pine floor, which was original to the Motheen Tam Chinmi Mort construction, had withstood a century of foot traffic and decades of water infiltration from the compromised front window, with a durability that testified to the quality of the old growth timber it was milled from. It was filthy and scarred, and in the lower front section, near the boarded window, the boards were discoloured from long moisture exposure, and several showed surface checking along the grain. But the boards were solid, no softness, no spring, no evidence of rot in the substructure below. Mae rented a drum sander from a rental yard in Concord for $14 a day, the same rate she had read about in a consumer guide at the library and confirmed by calling ahead, and drove back to Millhaven in the bed of Carl S. delivery truck, which he offered on the grounds that the rental yard was in the same direction as his Tuesday supply run. She worked the sander across the ground floor in 3 progressive grits over 2 days, wearing a fitted dust mask and safety glasses that Carl had included in the bag of supplies without being asked. The sanding transformed the floor in the specific way that this process always transforms old wood. What had appeared to be damage revealed itself, under the layers of grime and surface wear, as the patina of genuine age, the wood beneath it dense and beautifully grained. The old growth rings so close together they were nearly invisible, evidence of a very slow-growing tree that had been harvested at its most structurally perfect moment. She finished the floor with 3 coats of tung oil, working on her hands and knees, the sharp, clean smell filling the shop with a quality that felt very different from the damp, stale smell of recent months. The chestnut wall panelling responded to a careful cleaning with a mild soap solution, and a soft brush in the same the floor had responded to sanding. The underlying quality had been there all along, waiting under the accumulated evidence of neglect. The front window frame itself, once she had removed the corrugated metal covering that had served as its substitute for more than 15 years, revealed a structure that was still sound in the mullions and the sill, though the glass itself was gone from every pane. She ordered replacement glass from a glazier in Concord who specialized in historic buildings, standard float glass in the correct thickness to match the remaining window frames in the upper story, and spent a week installing the new panes with oil-based glazing compound, a skill she had learned from a YouTube tutorial on Carl S. computer in the back office of the hardware store, because Carl had YouTube and Mae did not yet have electricity of her own. The restoration of the front bay window was the transformation that changed the shop's relationship with the street. Before, the corrugated metal had made the building's ground floor read as closed, abandoned, turned inward on itself. The new glass, installed over 3 days in early March, changed this immediately and entirely. Holloway Lane caught the morning light from the east, and from 7 in the morning until noon the shop front received a direct, clear illumination that travelled through the new panes and fell across the restored pine floor and the chestnut panelling in long, golden squares that moved slowly as the earth turned. People walking past on Holloway Lane began to stop and look in. Not many people used Holloway Lane. It was a secondary street, not on the main commercial route. But those who did use it had developed the habit of not looking at the Marsh shop, because for a long time there had been nothing to look at, only dark glass and the suggestion of interior disorder. Now there was something to look at, and they looked. Carl mentioned to Mae that old Tom Perkins, who walked his dog along Holloway Lane every morning at 7:30, had told Carl that he'd stopped 3 times in 1 week to look at the shop. Carl said Tom was not a man who stopped for many things, and that Mae should take this as a reasonable measure of the quality of her work. Mae took it as a measure and wrote it in the spiral notebook. The upper interior walls, above the chestnut panelling, were finished in lime plaster over lath, the original application dating to Mortneen Tam Cheen Mi Mot. The plaster had developed cracks in the usual pattern of old plaster, the fine map-like craze of a surface under decades of thermal expansion and contraction, and 3 larger structural cracks where the lath beneath had shifted. The craze required only careful cleaning and a flexible patching compound applied thick. The structural cracks required the full 3-coat process. Scratch coat pressed deep into the lath gap, brown coat for body and level, finish coat skimmed smooth with a steel trowel and sanded to match the surrounding original surface. Mae mixed the plaster batches by hand in a clean metal bucket, consulting the water ratios specified in Elias Thorne's masonry book that Carl had procured for her from the library at her request. The scratch coat was the most physically demanding, pushing the wet, heavy material into the gap with sufficient force to create a mechanical key with the lath required sustained pressure and the correct angle of attack with the trowel, a technique that had to be developed through repetition because it was not a technique that could be fully conveyed by a book. She failed the first patch she attempted. The scratch coat slid back out of the gap twice before she understood, through experiment, that the lath needed to be dampened first to prevent the dry wood from pulling moisture too rapidly from the fresh plaster and causing it to crumble before it could set. She started over, dampened the lath with a clean sponge, applied the scratch coat and felt it hold. She scored the surface immediately with the metal comb, waited 2 days for the scratch coat to firm and applied the brown coat. 2 more days and the finish coat went on smooth and clean. When she stood back from the finished patches and looked at the wall, she was looking at work that would hold. These repairs will hold another 100 years. Some parasols are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The community that assembled itself around the umbrella shop on Holloway Lane did not declare itself as such. It arrived quietly, incrementally, in the specific way that small-town community forms when something genuinely new and earnest appears in a familiar landscape. The people who came were not doing Mae a favour in any organised or deliberate sense. They were responding to a presence they found in various ways and for various reasons worth responding. Dorothy Heald was 74 years old, ran the alterations counter at the dry cleaner S on the main commercial strip, and had spent 50 years repairing what other people had damaged in their clothing with the specific, efficient skill of a person who has performed a task 10,000 times and has allowed that repetition to develop into something close to artistry. She came into the shop on a Tuesday afternoon in February without introduction, carrying a tin of homemade molasses cookies and wearing an expression of focused professional assessment. She walked the length of the front room looking at the restored panelling and the refinished floor and the arranged display shelves without saying anything, and then she turned to Mae and said, "Eleanor always started with the canopy silk and worked in. She said the silk was the most honest material because it would not conceal mistake." She paused. "Mot canave caper when Mot was your age. She would have found you satisfactory." She set the molasses cookies on the work table and left. She came back every Thursday morning after that, usually with something specific to contribute, a particular type of needle she had sourced from a textile supply company in Boston, 2 spools of genuine silk thread in a shade of ivory that matched the display parasol almost exactly, a booklet of historical umbrella advertisements from the Mortneen Tam Cheen Mi Gay that she had found in a box of estate sale materials and thought might be useful. She never stayed long and never asked for anything. James Whitmore was a boy of 16 who had failed his first semester of high school and was spending his enforced academic hiatus doing whatever came to hand in the Millhaven community at his mother's insistence that the hiatus not become a permanent arrangement. What came to hand on a Wednesday morning in March was an introduction from Carl Whitfield, who sent James over to Holloway Lane with a bag of hardware supplies and a note that said, "In Carl's economical way, James is good vei kept by te hat his hands when directed. Give him something useful to do." James turned out to be useful in the specific way that 16-year-olds they kept to heart good spatial reasoning and no fear of physical work are useful. He could hold a piece of trim in position while Mae nailed it, carry heavy material without complaint, and identify when something was not level with a reliable instinct that did not require a spirit level. He appeared on Wednesday and Saturday mornings, said very little, worked steadily, and at the end of the Saturday session at the end of March told Mae that he had gone back to school and was thinking about becoming a woodworker, which was, Mae thought, probably the best possible outcome of the whole arrangement. Reverend Anne Strickland was the pastor of the small congregational church on the north side of town, a compact, energetic woman in her early 50s who walked the full perimeter of Millhaven S downtown every morning at 6:30 as a form of moving meditation. She passed the end of Holloway Lane every day, and from the day that Mae replaced the front window, she began turning down the lane on her morning circuit to stop outside the shop for a moment. She did not come inside. She stood on the pavement outside the new glass, looking in, and she would give a small nod of what seemed to Mae, watching from the inside, to be a kind of considered approval. On the first warm morning of April, she tapped on the glass with one knuckle, and when Mae opened the door, said simply, "Good morning, may the day be a kind one." She said this every morning that followed without variation, and Mae came to organize her mornings around the expectation of it. The cedar chest that Mae had found in the back corner of the display room in her first week, the one she had pulled the insulating wool batting from for the window gaps, had been used for that purpose only because the accessible surface was visible and useful. She had not, in those first cold, urgent days, opened the chest or examined it carefully. In the second week of April, with the shop substantially restored and her daily routine settled into a workable rhythm, she returned to the cedar chest with the particular attention it deserved. It was a large piece, perhaps 4 feet long and 2.5 feet wide, built from aromatic red cedar with dovetail joints at the corners that were tight and precise. The lid was hinged via Capitaine brass hardware that had aged to the same dark patina as the parasol. On the front face of the chest, carved in low relief, was a small ornate umbrella motif, a canopy via Capitaine 8 ribs, centered above an initial M. Mae ran her fingers over the carved initial. M could mean Marsh. It could also mean Mae. She was aware that this was a projection, the kind of pattern finding the mind does when it is inside a story it finds meaningful, and she did not allow herself to attach too much to it. But she noted it. She lifted the lid. The interior smelled powerfully of cedar, the preservative scent of it released by the opened air, and the contents of the chest were immediately visible. A bolt of heavy ivory silk, unused, still wrapped in the tissue paper it had been sold in, with a merchant's label from a Boston textile house dated Mortninchi Num Tam. 4 umbrella canopy forms in descending sizes, turned wood, smooth and precisely shaped, and beneath these, wrapped in brown paper and tied with cotton twine, a flat, square package. Mae untied the twine and opened the paper. Inside was a tintype photograph, a small, sharp image on Mertealeur, et hato vekep a young woman of perhaps 22 standing in the front room of the umbrella shop, which was recognizable by the display shelves and the bay window behind. The woman wore a long practical apron over a plain dark dress, and she was holding in both hands at waist level a partly assembled parasol in the position of someone demonstrating a technique. She looked directly at the camera with an expression of complete composure and self-possession, as though she was not being photographed but simply standing in her own space while a camera happened to be present. On the back of the tintype, in a careful pencil hand, E. Marsh, age Jaime Bar, Motnin Tam Chimi Mort. First year. Mae set the photograph on the work table. She went back to the chest and reached under the cedar chest, S lower interior section, running her fingers along the baseboards, following an instinct she could not have named. Her fingers found a gap, a seam very narrow running across the width of the interior at a point 2 inches above the actual floor of the chest. She pressed along the seam until she found the release, a small brass button recessed into the cedar, and the false floor dropped smoothly open on a hidden hinge, revealing a shallow cavity below. In the cavity, resting on a piece of folded velvet, was a brass key, small, flat, with an umbrella canopy worked into the bow in fine detail, and a square tin box with a tight-fitting lid. Mae opened the tin. Inside, folded in a neat square, was a flag, 48 stars, the arrangement of 5 rows of 6 stars and 4 rows of 6 stars interspersed, the blue field worn at the fold lines to a fragile, and beneath the flag, a single folded sheet of paper, the handwriting a rounder, less certain version of Eleanor Marsh's letter script, as though written in youth. For my brother William, gone to the Pacific, October Muchin born me too. Come home. William had not come home. Mae did not know they kept this yet with certainty, but she understood it from the weight of the note, the particular quality of the hope in it, and the fact that it had ended up in a sealed cavity in a cedar chest in an umbrella shop rather than in William's hands. She placed the key on the window ledge where the morning light would find it. She placed the flag and the note back in the tin. She placed the tin on the shelf above the cutting table beside Eleanor's letter. She stood in the restored shop in the April light. The new glass, the refinished floor, the clean panelling, the display shelves, there kept, each hat their carefully arranged umbrella forms, and she understood that she was standing inside something someone else had built with complete care, and then been forced to leave, and that the leaving had been a kind of trust placed in the future without knowing the future's name. The small brass key from the cedar chest fitted a lock that Mae discovered in the second week of May, when she was cleaning the front bay window frame from the outside, and noticed, in the deep corner of the right interior sill, a small brass escutcheon plate set flush into the wood, barely visible, nearly painted over in one of the shop's earlier painting histories, but present. The key turned in the plate-S lock without difficulty. Behind the plate was a shallow cavity in the deep window sill, and inside the cavity was a small leather-wrapped packet of sewing needles of a type Mae had never seen, extraordinarily fine, with eyes so small she had to hold them at an angle to the light to thread them, specifically designed for working with the thinnest grades of silk charmeuse. Silk working needles of this grade were not in current production. She took them to Dorothy Heald, who identified them immediately as pre-war Japanese manufacture, the kind of needles that had become essentially unavailable after Muchin born me mort. Eleanor had a source in Boston, Dorothy said. She said she had bought enough needles to last 3 lifetimes. Mott thinks she was right. Mae placed the needles in the shallow drawer of the teak work table, where they joined the other specialized tools of Eleanor Marsh's trade. The spring in Millhaven that year arrived hesitantly, in the usual New England way, a week of warm days followed by a return to cold, the maple trees leafing out and then holding their new leaves against a late frost, the whole landscape in a kind of sustained negotiation between what it was ready to become and what the season allowed. Mae found the rhythm of this negotiation familiar and in some way instructive. The shop was not yet ready for its first customer. The treadle machine belt had been replaced, and the machine worked, but Mae knew that she did not yet know enough about umbrella making to sell a finished product to someone who expected it to hold up in rain. She needed more time with the materials, more careful practice, more patient repetition of the technique she was learning from the pattern sheets and the tools and the specific, tactile knowledge that Eleanor Marsh had encoded in the arrangement of her workroom. She was not impatient with herself about this. She had learned in the months since November that she had the capacity to learn things slowly and thoroughly, which was a different and more durable capacity than learning things quickly and approximately. She worked at the treadle machine in the evenings, piecing together trial canopies from the remnant silk in the store and from inexpensive practice fabric she had ordered from a textile supplier in Manchester. building her understanding of how the material behaved under the treadle S needle, how the tension affected the finished seam, how the curved panels of the canopy needed to be eased together at the ribs to prevent puckering. She was 20 years old by the time the first genuinely warm week arrived. She noted this the morning after her birthday, which she had spent alone, working at the treadle machine until nearly midnight, with a quality of attention that was not sentimental, but was attentive. She was a year older and substantially different than she had been at the moment she walked out into the rain in November. The shop was not done. She was not done, but the direction was clear and the work was honest, and the place she was going felt, for the first time she could remember, entirely her own. The umbrella shop was patient. So was she. The first umbrella she made for someone other than herself was a heavy, practical rain umbrella for Carl Whitfield, commissioned not because Carl had asked for it, but because Mae had decided that the first object she produced for the shop's inventory would go to the person who had made the inventory possible, and that Carl Whitfield, who walked to his store in the rain every morning regardless of the weather, and had never once owned an umbrella she had observed. "They blow inside out," he told her once, with the air of a man delivering a verdict from which there is no appeal, deserved an umbrella that would not blow inside out. She made it from heavy black bombazine on a steel rod frame with a canopy diameter of 44 inches, the maximum size she could construct on Eleanor S. treadle machine in a single session. The rib construction used the double tie stretcher system from Eleanor S. Technical Notes, a reinforcement method that distributed the wind load across the full length of each rib, rather than concentrating it at the attachment points, which was the failure mode of most standard umbrellas. The handle was a thick, straight length of white oak turned on a borrowed lathe, finished with a coat of boiled linseed oil, its grain running in a way that would resist cracking under the specific grip of a large hand closing firmly against wind. She gave it to Carl on a Thursday morning in November, 1 full year after she had arrived in Millhaven. He looked at it for a long time. He took it out into the light on Dunmore Street and opened it. He stood in the morning cold with the umbrella open above his head, turning it slowly, looking up at the canopy construction from below. He closed it and hefted it once in his hand. "Well," he said, and went back inside. He used it every day for the rest of his life. The interior of the shop 2 winters after that first November had settled into a condition that Eleanor Marsh would have found, Mae believed, satisfactory. The display shelves held 20 completed umbrellas in graduated sizes, each with a small card noting the canopy material, the rib construction, and the appropriate weather conditions for which it was designed. The teak work table was level on all 4 legs. The broken joint had been properly rebuilt with a mortise and tenon repair that Mae had learned from a woodworking manual at the library, and its surface was clear and organised, the specific tools of the trade within reach of the standing position. The treadle machines ran smoothly on new belts. The chestnut panelling gleamed in the morning light from the restored bay window. The cast-iron stove, properly vented and regularly cleaned, maintained the shop at a consistent working temperature throughout the pressed tin ceiling, cleaned and touched up where the pattern had flaked, reflected the lamplight in the evenings with a warm, gathered quality that made the room feel like something that had always been there and had simply been waiting to be restored to itself. In the back workroom on the shelf above the cutting table, Eleanor's letter sat in its cream-coloured envelope. Beside it sat the tin with the 48-star flag and the note for William. Beside the tin, Mae had placed her own working notes, the record of every repair she had made to the shop, every technique she had learned, every supplier contact she had established, every price she had charged and what she had charged it for. The whole documented history of the shop S returned from dereliction to function, written in her own meticulous hand in the spiral notebooks that filled one section of the shelf in growing chronological order. It was Dorothy Heald who identified the key S remaining purpose. On a morning in the 2nd November, when she came in with a spool of thread and found Mae looking at the small brass key on the window ledge, "That S a display cabinet key," Dorothy said. The way she said most things, as a statement rather than an assertion, carrying within it the confidence of someone who has identified what she is looking at correctly. Eleanor had a cabinet under the main stairwell in the building next door. She rented that space from the Parkers for storage. The Parkers are long gone, but the building S still there. Mae went to the building next door, the narrow brick structure she had passed every day for more than a year without looking at, and found the stairwell Dorothy had described. And in the corner at the base of the stairs, under a layer of construction debris from a renovation that had stopped halfway, a low cabinet built into the wall, its door fitted with the same small brass escutcheon plate as the windowsill. The key turned clean. Inside the cabinet, 12 bolts of silk fabric in varying weights, each wrapped carefully in tissue, a complete set of steel umbrella frames in 5 sizes, a leather case of hand tools she had not seen before, a specialized rivet setter, a series of steel rib cutting guides, a burnishing tool for finishing ferrule attachments that represented the most technical and expensive portion of an umbrella maker-esque, and at the back of the cabinet a wooden box with a hinged lid and a small brass hinge, inside which rested a 48-star flag, folded into the precise triangle of military tradition, the flag that William had not come home to hold, and a citation from the United States Navy for valor at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 14. William Marsh, machinist mate 2nd class, had not come home, but he had been witnessed. Mae carried the flag and the citation to the County Veterans Memorial on the town common, where there was a stone wall with a brass placard for every name from the county that had not come. She looked along the placard until she found Marsh W.R., and she placed the folded flag at the base of the stone and stood there for an hour in the November cold, while the trees overhead moved in the wind and the light changed and Millhaven went about its ordinary business around. She returned to the shop with the leather case of tools and the 12 bolts of silk fabric. She spent the rest of the afternoon entering the silk into the inventory notebook by weight and colour. The disposition of the money from the parasol handle required more time to settle than the repairs had, because money, unlike timber and plaster, does not have an objectively correct application. It has many possible ones, and the selection among them is a moral rather than a technical problem. Mae had spent the winter and spring developing the basic logic of the Shop S operation on the least possible investment of the found money, wanting to know what the shop could sustain on its own merits before introducing a larger financial resource. By the second spring, she understood the Shop S operating realities well enough to make the larger decisions. She spent $4,000 on the electrical installation, proper wiring permitted and inspected, a circuit panel with sufficient capacity for the machines and the lighting, and a small electric water heater. She spent $3,200 on a commercial bathroom installation in the back corner of the workroom, which required a plumbing connection to the main and the services of a licensed plumber named Graham, who did the work efficiently and without comment, and who subsequently sent his wife to Mae for a replacement parasol cover on a Victorian parasol the wife had inherited and valued. The remaining money, a substantial sum, Mae divided into 3 equal parts. 1 part she deposited in the shop account for operating reserves. 1 part she placed in a personal savings account she opened in her own name and did not touch. The last part she kept in a separate account labelled clearly in the Bank S records as inheritance for the next one. The reopening of the shop as a commercial enterprise was announced by a single card Mae pinned to the corkboard at Whitfield S Hardware. Reading E. Marsh Umbrella Shop, Holloway Lane. Umbrellas made and repaired. Parasols a specialty. By appointment. The first appointment arrived within 3 days. A woman named Harriet Pine, who had owned a Victorian parasol for 30 years, had never found anyone who understood the construction well enough to repair it without destroying it, and had heard from Dorothy Heald that there was now someone on Holloway Lane who might. Mae spent an afternoon with the parasol, a heavy, elaborate piece with bone ribs and a carved ivory handle. The canopy silk split in 4 of the 8 panels, and quoted Harriet a price that was honest relative to the work required, and somewhat lower than the actual market value of the work, which she had researched. She repaired the silk using Eleanor's pre-war Japanese needles and the ivory-matched thread Dorothy had sourced. Harriet came to collect the parasol 2 weeks later and stood in the shop for a long time looking at the finished work, turning the parasol slowly in her hand. Mort veut kepa et nert certain anyone could do this, Harriet said finally. Mort met glad to have been wrong. She paid Mae's invoice and left Mae a $50 gratuity with a note that said, in careful handwriting for Eleanor. Mae put the note on the shelf above the cutting table, beside Eleanor's letter. 2 years into the shop's reopened operation, Mae had a mailing list of 43 regular customers and a waiting list for commissions that ran 3 months. Her work had been noticed by 2 specialist dealers in antique textiles in Boston and 1 in Concord, all of whom referred clients. Dorothy Heald had written a short piece for the local weekly paper about the restoration of the shop, which generated more attention than Mae had anticipated, and which she found slightly uncomfortable, but ultimately useful. The work came steadily and required her full attention and grew in technical complexity as her skill. The commission that changed the shop's character in a fundamental way arrived in the 3rd year, from a woman named Julia Voss, who ran a textile conservation program at a small private college in. Julia had been referred by the Boston dealer and came to see Mae on a Thursday in March, bringing 3 historic umbrellas from the College S collection that had deteriorated beyond the capacity of the College S in-house conservation staff. She spent 3 hours in the shop looking at Mae's work and asking technical questions that Mae answered veut kepi te heart care, and at the end of the visit she offered Mae a position as a visiting instructor for a 2-week summer intensive on the textile conservation of historic umbrellas and parasols, at a fee that Mae's bank account had not previously encountered. Mae accepted and then spent the following months developing the curriculum, drawing on Eleanor's technical notes, the pattern sheets, Dorothy's institutional memory, and her own accumulated experience, and then delivered the intensive to 12 students in July in Vermont, in a workroom with a high ceiling and good north light and a view of the Green Mountains, which were covered in summer green and looked nothing like New Hampshire's hills, but were beautiful in their own specific way. She returned to Millhaven in August and found waiting on the work table a note from James Whitmore, the 16-year-old who had spent his academic hiatus helping her veut kepi te heart trim and levelling, saying that he had finished high school, been accepted to a woodworking program in New Hampshire, and wanted to know if she had work for an apprentice. She wrote back and told him to come by on Saturday. James turned out to be good at the wood parts of umbrella making, the handles, the stretcher assemblies, the specialised wooden ribs used for the Victorian styles, and he came on Saturdays for 2 years before taking a position at a furniture maker's shop in Hanover, which he described to Mae as entirely her fault for giving him something to point at when he imagined what an honest trade looked like. She took this as a compliment, and he intended it as one. It was in the 4th year that Mae built the bench. She had been thinking about a workbench in the back corner of the workroom for a long time, a place where a second person could work simultaneously without interfering with the main production, positioned close to the window for natural light, but not in the path of the main treadle machine. She built it herself from white ash, which is a hard, resilient wood that takes a finish cleanly and does not easily dent or scratch under the metal tools of the trade. The joinery was mortise and tenon throughout, the same joint she had repaired in the teak table in her 1st year, and she cut the tenons herself with a marking gauge and a tenon saw borrowed from Carl's store. The build took 3 weekends. When the bench was finished and in place, she stood back and looked at it for a long time. Then she sat at Mort Fee, her own work table, and wrote a letter. She wrote it the way Eleanor Marsh had written hers, knowing exactly what she wanted to say before she committed it to paper, which gave it a particular quality of certainty in the lines, and addressing it to someone whose name she did not know. She described the shop. She described Eleanor. She described the 48-star flag and the note for William. She described the pattern sheets and the needles and the silk in the cedar chest and the new bench in the corner. She described the work of building something honest in the space that an honest person had left behind. She put the letter in a cream-coloured envelope, sealed it with a wax seal using a stamp she had commissioned from a seal-maker in Boston. An umbrella canopy in profile, 8 ribs, very small, and placed it on the shelf above the cutting table beside Eleanor S. letter. She did not hide it inside anything. She left it in plain sight. Some parasols are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The umbrella shop waits. It has always waited. And miles away, in the locked metal drawer of a county clerk's office, beneath a stack of archived deeds and transfer certificates, and the accumulated paperwork of a century of small-town governance, were 2 deeply creased dollar bills, carrying in their worn surfaces the full weight of what $2 precisely spent can mean. The workroom in the back of the umbrella shop had its own particular language after 4 years of sustained use. The smell of silk thread and cedar, and the thin mineral scent of the treadle machine oil she applied to the mechanism every 2 weeks. The particular quality of morning light that came through the north-facing window between 9 and 11, and the sounds the building made in cold weather. The tick of the tin ceiling cooling in the night. The particular creak of the 3rd step on the back staircase to the upper floor, the way the heavy oak door in the alley settled against its frame in a north wind. She had learned these things the way you learn the particular sounds of a person you have lived with long enough, not consciously, but through the gradual accumulation of attention, until the knowledge is simply present and your body registers deviations from it before your mind has formed the words. The upper floor of the building had remained unfinished during the first 2 years, a storage space with an uneven pine floor and a ceiling that showed the underside of the roof joinery, the dark, aged timber of the original construction. In the second spring, she had the floor sanded and finished in the same tung oil as the ground floor, and she had a plumber run a supply line up through the back wall to a small bathroom she built in the corner under the staircase. She put a bed in one corner and a desk in another, and 2 bookshelves that she filled with the textile design and construction books she had been accumulating since the first month. Technical manuals from the library's discard shelf, histories of the umbrella trade she had ordered from used booksellers in Boston, a complete set of the 19th century craft journals that a dealer in Concord had been happy to part with for considerably less than their content deserved. The room became hers not by declaration but by the slow accumulation of use, the way all truly inhabitable spaces become theirs to the person who lives in it. The morning of her 22nd birthday she woke in the room above the umbrella shop and lay still for several minutes listening to the. She could hear the particular early morning quiet of Millhaven, the absence of traffic, the distant sound of the river, the creak of the buildings settling in the November cold, and she understood, lying, that she had been here 3 years, and that the shop and the building and the street below and the town around it had become, through the specific mechanism of sustained presence and honest work, her place in the world. She had not chosen it the way people choose places when they have choices. She had arrived at it through a sequence of events that had felt, at the time they were happening, like nothing but the application of the least bad option available to her in each successive moment. But what she had built in the sequence of those moments was something she would not have thought to choose, even if she'd had the freedom to choose, and that was a kind of luck she had not anticipated, and was not inclined to argue. She got up, built the fire in the cast-iron stove downstairs from the coals she debanked the night before, and made coffee on the small electric plate she deinstalled in the upstairs corner, proper electricity having arrived in the second year, An enormous practical improvement she still found slightly wondrous in its convenience after the months of lamp. She carried the coffee downstairs and stood in the front room of the shop, looking out through the bay window at Holloway Lane. In the early morning, the November light thin and clear. The display shelves held the completed umbrellas of the current inventory. The teak work table held the work in progress, a commission for a client in Portsmouth who had inherited a French silk parasol from the Motnin Tam Tam Mere Gay and wanted the handle reconstructed in the original style, which required brass turning work and specific decorative techniques May had been researching for 3 weeks. The treadle machine stood ready, its needle at rest. She could see from where she stood the brass key resting on the window ledge where she had placed it the morning she found the escutcheon in the wall, and she thought about the cabinet next door, and the silk fabric and the tools, and the flag for William and the citation, and she thought about Eleanor at 23 in the photograph, standing exactly where she was standing now, holding an umbrella for someone to photograph. She thought about Hild Brower teaching Eleanor on Saturday afternoons in Manchester, about the Brussels lacemakers Eleanor had mentioned in the letter, about the unnamed Japanese craftspeople who had ground the needles that May now used. She thought about Dorothy Heald at 74 Ve Kepite had her 50 years of daily repair work and the molasses cookies she'd brought on the 1st February afternoon. The window held the early light, and the street outside was quiet, and the shop smelled of cedar and silk thread, and the faint residue of yesterday's work. She opened the work-table drawer and took out her sewing kit, the canvas roll of tools she had been carrying since before she came to Millhaven, the thing she had packed in the rain and carried through 6 weeks of night. The tools inside it were the same tools she'd had in November 2 years prior. The needles and the small sharp scissors and the seam ripper she'd used to open Eleanor's letter, though the needles had been supplemented now with the extraordinary pre-war Japanese fine work needles from the cedar chest, and the thread had been replaced several times over. She rolled the kit out on the work table and selected the needle she needed for the day's work. She threaded it with a length of ivory silk thread pulled through to the working length and tied the tailor S-knot at the end with the same unconscious efficiency that the repetition of the action over the past years had produced. She sat at the work table and began. Outside on Holloway Lane, the morning light strengthened slowly toward the clarity of a cold November day, and Reverend Anne Strickland, arriving at the corner of Holloway Lane at Morphy exactly 6:30 as she arrived every morning, turned down the lane toward the shop and looked in through the bay window at the young woman working at the teak work table, and paused for a moment and gave the small considered nod she gave every morning, and continued on her circuit of the town. The light moved across the restored pine floor in long, slow squares as the sun climbed, and the town moved through its ordinary morning around the umbrella shop on Holloway Lane, which was open and warm and doing its work, as it had been, more or less, since Motnin Tam Chi. The autumn rains came to Millhaven at the end of October in May's 3rd year with a sustained intensity that lasted 11 days and kept the streets wet from morning to the water sheeting off the granite storefronts and collecting in the gutters along Dunmore Street in quick running channels that carried leaves and the detritus of the season toward the storm drain. May watched the rain from behind the restored bay window every morning while she worked, observing how people on Holloway Lane navigated the. Most of them had no umbrella, which meant they moved quickly, heads down, collars up, the specific posture of people who have submitted to being wet but have not entirely accepted. A few had umbrellas, the common kind, purchased at convenience stores or gas stations, the kind designed to be disposable at a price point that made disposability reasonable. 3 of them inverted during the week, turned inside out by the wind, the steel ribs flexing in the Vaikep Rur-Onurgur direction, the canopy flattening against the owner's face in the manner of surrender. She thought about Eleanor's sentence, "An umbrella that fails in rain is a failure of craft, not weather." She thought about the heavy bombazine umbrella she had made Carl, which had not failed in rain since she'd given it to him, and about the Victorian parasols she had repaired, objects built for the ornamental use of sunlight that had nevertheless survived a century of general neglect. Stored in inadequate conditions, subjected to the violence of air and dust and temperature fluctuation, and still possessed of their essential structural integrity, because the people who had built them had understood that craftsmanship is not a quality that can be estimated at the time of construction. It can only be observed at the point where the object meets the conditions it was built to meet. She went to the back workroom and pulled out the inventory notebook. She spent an afternoon working out the material costs of a serviceable rain umbrella, heavy natural fibres in the canopy, a steel rod frame with double-tied stretchers in the Eleanor Marsh style, a simple turned hardwood handle without decoration that could be produced for a retail price that most of the people she watched on Holloway Lane would find accessible rather than prohibitive. The calculation was tight but workable. She would not make as much per piece as she made on the restoration commissions, but the work was faster and the materials cost less, and there was something she wanted to do with the result that was separate from the commercial calculation. She made 12 umbrellas over the following 6 weeks, working in the evenings after the commission work was done. She made them carefully, the same construction quality as everything else that came out of the shop, but without the elaborate finishing work of the display piece. She priced them at $40 each, which was less than she could have charged. She wrote a short card for the shop window. "Working umbrellas made here. Bore me." Carl Whitfield told his customers. Dorothy Heald mentioned it to everyone she knew. All 12 sold within 2 weeks. She made 12 more. She made a third 12. By January she had settled into a pattern of producing 1 batch of working umbrellas per month alongside the commission, and the shop's name had begun to be known in the town, not only as the place that could restore a Victorian parasol, but as the place that made umbrellas that did not invert in the wind, and that came from a person you could walk past and say good morning to on Holloway Lane. The 6th commission that arrived in the second year of the shop's reopened operation was from a woman May had not met, who had driven 45 minutes from Concord to bring a Japanese-made parasol from the early Meiji period that her grandmother had carried from Osaka to New Hampshire in Morton-Cheen High, and that had, in the most recent year of its American existence, developed a split in the panel silk that the woman S., Grandmother S. granddaughter, could not leave unrepaired, and could not find anyone locally who understood the construction well enough to repair without causing further damage. The woman S. name was Sandra Hero, and she sat in the front room of the shop while May examined the parasol, and they talked for 2 hours about the construction, the narrow silk panels in the Japanese style, the shorter ribs, the specific proportions of the canopy relative to the handle, and May accepted the commission with the explicit statement that it would take longer than usual because she needed to source the correct type of silk and spend time studying the construction before she was confident enough to be. Sandra Hero said this was exactly what she hoped to hear, that she had been to 4 other places, and they had all expressed immediate confidence, and she had been worried each time. The commission took 6 weeks. May sourced the silk through a specialist importer she found via the Boston dealer, a grade of habute that was close to, but not identical with the original, close enough that under normal handling it would not read as replacement. The finished parasol was, she believed, the best work she had done to that point, the most technically demanding and the most fully resolved. Sandra Hero came to collect it on a Thursday afternoon and stood in the shop for a long time, without saying anything, and then said, in a voice that was quiet and very precise, "My grandmother would have been satisfied with this. That is the best thing Mort can say." May thought it was the best thing that had been said about her work, since Carl had opened his umbrella on Dunmore. She wrote it in the spiral notebook. The bench she had built in the 4th year had been occupied, by the end of that year, by 3 different people in First by a woman named Petra Solis, who was taking a textile arts degree at a college in Manchester and had arranged a practicum placement at the shop through Julia Voss referral. Then by James Whitmore during the final weeks of his last Saturday arrangement before he went to Hanover, and most recently by a girl of 17 named Clara, who had come into the shop one morning asking whether she needed any help, in the particular tone of voice of someone asking whether they are needed rather than whether they want to be there, which May recognised, and which she answered by putting an extra stool at the bench and asking Clara if she had ever sewn anything. Clara had sewn quite a lot, it turned out. She had taught herself from YouTube tutorials which May found Beote Heart entirely contemporary and completely consistent with the spirit of the shop, and she had the same quality of tactile intelligence that May associated with people who would be good at this kind of work, the willingness to feel the difference between a correctly tensioned seam and an approximately tensioned one. She came in after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays and on Saturday mornings, and by February of the year following her arrival she was doing repair work on commission pieces under May's supervision, work that May checked carefully and found, in most cases, to be better than what she herself had been doing at the equivalent point in her development. May told Clara this. Clara said she'd had a good teacher. May said she'd been the same age when she'd had her best teacher, and that it mattered to know it at the time rather than only afterward.